Somewhere on the other side of the planet, seismographs in Tokyo and instruments buried in the deserts of Southern California registered nothing unusual that day. And yet within 7 weeks, both of those places would be shaking too. This is not a story about one earthquake. This is a story about 3 of them, thousands of miles apart, arriving in the same summer, and the very uncomfortable question every seismologist on the planet is now being asked in rooms they would rather not be asked it in. Is this a coincidence, or is the Earth trying to tell us something we are not yet equipped to hear? Start with the number, because the number is the thing that refuses to leave your head once you've heard it. 6,125. And underneath those numbers, a second number that the United States Geological Survey does not say lightly. Their pager system, the algorithm built to estimate mass casualty earthquakes before official counts catch up, has projected that the real total could exceed 10,000. Not an estimate pulled from panic. A model built on population density, building codes, and the physics of a magnitude 7.5 rupture happening at rush hour in a country whose infrastructure was already buckling before the ground ever moved. Somewhere between 6,000 confirmed and 10,000 feared, there is a gap. And inside that gap are people. Search teams are still trying to find, more than a month later, under concrete that used to be an apartment block. Venezuela's relationship with catastrophic earthquakes is not new, and that history matters here, because it explains why so many buildings that came down in June should never have been standing the way they were standing in the first place. Caracas has been leveled by major earthquakes before. The 1812 quake that struck the city killed an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 people, and it remains, over 2 centuries later, a reference point Venezuelan seismologists still cite when they talk about worst-case scenarios. When the geology did what coastal basin geology always eventually does, there was very little standing between ordinary apartment buildings and total collapse. This is the quiet, brutal truth behind almost every high casualty earthquake in the modern world. The magnitude decides how hard the ground shakes, but the death toll is decided almost entirely by what was built on top of it, years before anyone knew the date the fault would finally let go. Here is what almost nobody outside the immediate region understood in the first 48 hours. A foreshock and a main shock, separated by half a minute, both large enough to be historic events on their own, arriving as a pair. Caracas, the capital, absorbed the brunt of it. But it was La Guaira, the port state hugging the coastline just north of the capital, where the geology turned cruel. Soft coastal sediment does something to seismic waves that bedrock does not. It amplifies them. It holds the shaking longer. Buildings that might have survived a rupture of the same size on solid rock simply did not have a chance on ground that liquefied and rolled beneath them. 80% of the structures in that state came down, and when you say that number out loud, it stops sounding like a statistic and starts sounding like an entire coastline erased in under a minute. What followed is the part of the story that rarely makes it into a headline, because a headline has room for one earthquake, not the 6 weeks that come after it. As of the middle of August, humanitarian agencies were still filing situation reports every few days. Because the crisis had not resolved into recovery, it had settled into something closer to a permanent emergency. Nearly 212,000 people had accessed some form of essential aid through the joint effort of the United Nations, international medical teams, and local authorities working with resources that were exhausted before the second month even began. The Pan American Health Organization mobilized more than 30 metric tons of medical supplies out of its strategic reserve in Panama. Field hospitals logged over 34,000 consultations and more than 550 surgeries in the weeks after the quake. A number that tells you something brutal about the nature of the injuries. These were not sprained ankles. These were crush injuries, spinal trauma, amputations. the kind of medicine practiced in tents because the hospitals themselves had become part of the rubble, and the estimate of how many people were living in the highest intensity shaking zone when it happened stands at over 700,000. 700,000 human beings, in the exact geography where the worst of two overlapping earthquakes chose to converge. There is a political layer to this that the government in Caracas would very much prefer, stayed buried under the rubble along with everything else, and it did not stay buried. As the death toll climbed past 6,000 in early August, the interim administration faced open, public accusations of a response that arrived too slow and organized too poorly. Criticism sharp enough that it reached international coverage even as search and rescue operations were technically still active. A government announcing a rising body count while simultaneously fielding accusations of negligence is a combination that tends to end careers. And in Caracas, in the weeks after the quake, it was doing exactly that to the credibility of the people meant to be leading the recovery. Meanwhile, in Miami, a different kind of response was taking shape entirely outside government channels. A benefit concert pulling in more than 15 major Latin artists. A diaspora reaching back across the water because the state apparatus back home could not be trusted to reach far enough on its own. When a country's own citizens abroad start organizing parallel relief efforts, that tells you something about how thin the confidence in official channels had worn. Zoom out from Venezuela for a moment, and the picture gets even heavier, because this was not an isolated shock in an otherwise quiet region. Weeks earlier, neighboring Colombia had been struck by its own magnitude 7.4 earthquake, a rupture large enough that the Miami benefit concert was organized to raise money for victims of both disasters simultaneously, not one. Two catastrophic earthquakes in two neighboring South American nations within the same general window, each large enough to dominate a news cycle on its own merits, arriving back to back instead. If you are the kind of person who tracks global seismic activity for a living, that is already an unusual pairing before California or Japan ever enter the conversation. It is the first thread in what would become, by August, a much larger and much stranger tapestry. Now here's where the story turns. Because while Venezuela was still counting bodies in the first week of August, 7,000 kilometers to the north, the ground in California began doing something scientists have a very specific vocabulary for, and none of that vocabulary is reassuring. On the 11th of August, a swarm, not a single earthquake, a swarm, meaning dozens upon dozens of small ruptures with no single dominant main shock, struck along the San Andreas Fault zone. At least 19 distinct earthquakes were recorded in a single cluster. And this was not the only swarm that month. Within days, seismologists were tracking simultaneous swarm activity in multiple locations across the state at once, an unusual enough pattern that even researchers who spend their careers explaining away California's constant background tremor started using words like watching closely instead of the usual reassurances. The most unsettling of these sequences hit the Hayward Fault. And if you don't already know why the Hayward Fault specifically makes seismologists nervous, here's the short version. It runs directly beneath one of the most densely populated urban corridors in the United States, threading underneath the East Bay, and it has not produced a major rupture in over a century and a half. Faults that go quiet for that long do not stay quiet forever. They store strain, and every year that passes without release is a year the eventual rupture has more energy behind it. The swarm activity in mid-August began with a magnitude 3.8 event near San Leandro, initially misread by early instruments as a 4.1 before the number was revised downward. On its own, that is unremarkable. It is the pattern around it that isn't. A geophysicist from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, watching the same data feed as everyone else, put the threshold plainly. Current activity sits within normal parameters, but if the swarming intensifies, if you start seeing multiple magnitude 4 events along the Hayward Fault or nearby in rapid succession, that crosses into something bigger happening beneath the surface. And then he said the sentence that should make anyone living in the Bay Area sit up straight. The next 6 to 12 months carry elevated risk, specifically because of how much major seismic activity has already unfolded elsewhere in the Americas this year. He was not being poetic. He was describing a hypothesis seismologists take seriously and argue about constantly, that large ruptures can, under the right conditions, subtly redistribute stress across a wider tectonic system, nudging other already strained faults closer to their own breaking point. It is not settled science. It is not confirmed. But it is being said out loud by credentialed scientists in the same month Venezuela was still burying its dead. This is not California's first swarm of the year either, which matters more than it might seem. In May, an earthquake swarm rattled the Imperial County desert near Brawley. Hundreds of small events overnight, strong enough that nearly 200,000 people across Southern California felt shaking, ranging from light to strong. The Brawley seismic zone has a documented history of exactly this kind of behavior. a fault system tightly interlinked with the imperial fault zone and known for producing swarms rather than single dramatic ruptures. Two swarms, months apart, in geologically distinct parts of the same state, both in a year when the state's overall seismic tempo was already elevated. To understand why researchers reach for words like overdue instead of staying purely descriptive, you have to understand what California has already survived and what it has not survived in a very long time. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, magnitude 6.9, killed 63 people and collapsed a section of the Bay Bridge during a World Series broadcast watched by millions. The 1994 Northridge earthquake, magnitude 6.7, killed dozens more and caused over $20 billion in damage in the Los Angeles basin. Those are the earthquakes that live in California's public memory. But neither of them was a Hayward fault rupture, and neither of them tested a fault sitting directly beneath a modern urban corridor home to millions, the way the Hayward fault does today. The last time that specific fault ruptured significantly was 1868, before most of the East Bay had been built at all. Every decade since has added more concrete, more population density, more critical infrastructure, sitting directly above a fault that seismologists openly describe as loaded and waiting. That is the context behind a swarm of small earthquakes suddenly becoming a story large enough to reach national coverage. It is not that a magnitude 3.8 event is inherently alarming. It is that a magnitude 3.8 event on this specific fault, in the specific year, arriving in a cluster instead of alone, is exactly the kind of signal researchers have spent decades warning the public to take seriously rather than dismiss as routine California noise. None of this, taken individually, is proof of anything beyond California being California. It is, after all, laced with more active faults than almost anywhere on Earth. And it has produced swarms before, going back through 2018, 2015, 2003, 1990, and further. But the frequency, the geographic spread, and the timing relative to a hemisphere-altering earthquake in South America are precisely the combination that has pushed this from routine monitoring into something researchers are actively flagging in public statements, which is not something seismologists do casually. They know exactly how a phrase like overdue for a major quake lands in a press cycle, and they said it anyway. And then there is Japan, which, by the time California's swarms began, was already 3 weeks into managing the aftermath of its own major rupture and had not finished before a second one arrived. On the 28th of July, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake struck the Kumamoto region of southern Japan at 4:27 in the afternoon, and within minutes, a tsunami advisory went out for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas. Roughly 300,000 people in Kumamoto Prefecture were ordered into evacuation centers. Several buildings collapsed, including a shopping mall. By the time Japan's prime minister addressed the nation the following morning, 13 people had been confirmed dead, with more injured or still unaccounted for as rescue crews worked through the night. What makes this earthquake sit differently in the historical record is not just the death toll, it's the fault line that produced it. Seismologists rapidly identified the source as the Hinagu Fault Zone, the exact same structure implicated in the devastating 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes. Japanese researchers had flagged this fault as a long-term concern for a decade, and satellite imagery in the days after the July rupture confirmed ground displacement and elevation changes spanning a 10-kilometer stretch, along with a visible surface rupture tracing the fault line itself. Experts studying the data floated a theory with real weight behind it, that the 2016 earthquake sequence may have left a segment of the Hinagu Fault unbroken, an area of the fault that stored up strain rather than releasing it a decade ago, and that this July's rupture was that unfinished business finally letting go. The aftershock sequence did not politely wrap itself up within a few days either. On the 9th of August, less than 2 weeks after the Kumamoto rupture, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck roughly 80 kilometers southeast of Hachinohe, in Aomori Prefecture, at just before 3 in the morning local time, at a depth of 34 kilometers. It registered as the strongest earthquake to hit Japan in 11 days, meaning the underlying seismic tempo across the country had not slowed since Kumamoto. It had simply shifted location. Over 370,000 people live within 100 kilometers of that epicenter alone, and the sequence produced multiple aftershocks in the days that followed, one reaching magnitude 4.8. 2 separate earthquake sequences on opposite ends of the country, within the same 2-week window, in a nation that sits directly atop one of the most seismically hyperactive stretches of crust on the planet. Japan's relationship with the Kumamoto region carries its own decade-long shadow, and it is worth understanding exactly what happened there in 2016 to grasp why the July 2026 rupture felt, to seismologists watching it unfold, less like a new disaster and more like a debt finally coming due. In April 2016, Kumamoto was struck by a sequence of major earthquakes, a magnitude 6.2 foreshock, followed roughly 28 hours later by a magnitude 7 main shock, a sequence unusual enough in its own right that it forced Japanese seismology to rewrite some of its assumptions about how foreshock sequences behave. That 2016 rupture killed over 270 people and destroyed thousands of homes along the Hinagu and Futagawa fault zones. What Japanese researchers have long suspected, and what this July's rupture appears to confirm, is that the 2016 sequence did not release all the accumulated strain along the southern portion of the Hinagu fault. A segment stayed locked, stayed loaded, and sat quietly building pressure for a decade while the region rebuilt around it, went back to manufacturing semiconductors and automobiles, and moved on. 10 years later, that segment let go. It is one of the clearest real-world illustrations available anywhere on the planet right now of exactly the mechanism seismologists worry about most. A fault that never fully finishes an earthquake, leaving behind a smaller, quieter, more dangerous unknown for the next generation to inherit without warning. The economic aftershock of Kumamoto tells its own story about how deeply interconnected the modern world has become with a single fault line most people had never heard of a month earlier. Kumamoto is not just a population center. It is a semiconductor manufacturing hub, home to fabrication plants that feed global supply chains for everything from smartphones to automobiles. In the days after the earthquake, TSMC's major fabrication facility in the region went offline, only returning to normal production in early August. Sony halted image sensor production and needed until mid-August to climb back to pre-earthquake output. Renesas, Tokyo Electron, Nissan, and Mitsubishi Motors all reported halted lines, delayed restarts, and supply disruptions, rippling outward to manufacturers who had never set foot in Kyushu, but depended entirely on parts that came from it. A single fault rupturing beneath one Japanese prefecture reached into car factories and electronics assembly lines on the other side of the planet within days. That is not a metaphor about interconnected fault systems. That is a literal supply chain, and it broke the same week the ground broke. So here's where three separate stories start to feel like they are circling the same question, even though seismologists will tell you, accurately, and it's worth saying plainly, that there is no confirmed physical mechanism directly linking a rupture off the coast of Venezuela to a swarm on the Hayward Fault, to a fault zone reactivating in Kyushu. These are three different tectonic systems, three different plate boundaries, thousands of kilometers apart, and the honest scientific position is that treating them as one connected event risks manufacturing a narrative the data doesn't fully support. But here is the more unsettling honest position, the one that doesn't make for a clean answer either way. A rising number of researchers are no longer willing to dismiss the possibility of broader stress transfer across a global tectonic system outright. It's a live hypothesis, not folklore. Large enough ruptures shift stress in ways that propagate, sometimes locally and obviously, the way an aftershock does, and sometimes in ways that are subtler, distributed, and only become visible when you zoom out to a scale of months and continents instead of days and kilometers. The geophysicist from Lawrence Livermore said the quiet part out loud when he tied California's elevated risk window directly to so much activity in the Americas this year. He did not say Venezuela caused California's swarms. He said it's hard to rule out that they're connected. That is a scientist's way of admitting the uncertainty is real, not performative. And uncertainty, when you're talking about faults capable of killing thousands of people in 30 seconds, is not a comfortable place to leave an audience. So let's sit inside it honestly, because that is more useful than false comfort in either direction. The Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped band of fault lines and volcanic arcs that wraps around almost the entire Pacific Ocean basin, touches both California and Japan directly. They sit on connected, if distant, segments of the same overarching tectonic framework, where the Pacific Plate grinds against the North American and Okhotsk microplates. Venezuela sits outside that ring entirely, on the boundary between the Caribbean and South American plates, a genuinely separate system with its own independent stress history. So the geological connection, if one exists at all, would have to work through mechanisms far more indirect than one ring, one system. Global-scale elastic stress redistribution through the Earth's crust and upper mantle, the kind of effect that some researchers have proposed after historically massive earthquakes elsewhere, and which remains genuinely debated rather than settled within the seismological community. What is not debated is simpler and in some ways scarier. Three of the most seismically dangerous regions on the planet, all populated by tens of millions of people, all experience significant headline-level seismic activity within the same 8-week window, on a planet where the total number of major earthquakes per year has stayed roughly statistically consistent for decades. Either this is an unusually intense but ultimately random clustering, which happens because probability doesn't distribute evenly across a calendar year, or it is evidence of something researchers are only beginning to have the data density and modeling power to detect. In California, the Hayward Fault swarm sits, as of the most recent data, within what scientists call normal parameters, But normal is doing enormous uneasy work in that sentence because normal on an overdue fault means something different than normal anywhere else, and the explicit 6 to 12 month risk window flagged by researchers has barely begun. And in Japan, the Hinagu fault zone, having apparently finished unfinished business from 2016, now sits under renewed and intensive monitoring, while 800 kilometers north, whatever produced the Hachinohe sequence in Aomori remains, for now, simply described as ongoing. 3 fault systems. In La Guaira, families are still sleeping in tent encampments along the same coastline where surfers once paddled out for sunset sessions, now walking past those same tents to hold memorial paddle-outs for neighbors who didn't survive June. In the East Bay, commuters cross the Hayward Fault twice a day without a second thought, on freeways and BART tunnels built decades before anyone had the instrumentation to measure exactly how loaded that fault has become. In Kyushu, factory workers who spent July sleeping in evacuation centers went back to assembly lines in August, building the exact same semiconductors and camera sensors that end up, months later, inside the phone this video might be playing on right now. That refusal to overclaim is not evasiveness. It is, if anything, the most honest thing a scientist can offer you in a moment like this, an admission that the models are good enough to describe what already happened, but not yet good enough to promise what happens next. Seismology, for all its instruments and satellites and centuries of accumulated data, remains a science of probabilities, not prophecies.